Good afternoon, I'm Ana Ilie from our journal, the student publication for Calista Trogaș National College. Today, we are at the Pelin Ateneum in the company of Adam Heron, acclaimed as pianist and the BBC Young Musician from 2018. Mr. Heron, we are honored to meet you here. Since your impressive TV debut, you always seem to have a busy schedule concerting around the world. How do you maintain a healthy work-life balance?
It's a very good question, and a very important question that I think all musicians and artists should consider. How do I maintain a healthy work-life balance? To be honest, the answer is not to work too much. I think many musicians have crafted their identity around music, and that means that work has become almost synonymous with their life. So you have to create your own boundaries. That is of paramount importance. And of course to realize that in life, work is not everything.
You have performed alongside distinguished musicians from different countries. How long does it take to prepare a recital to synchronize with your stage partners?
Well, in my experience, a lot of the preparation is done by myself. That's to say that when preparing a program of 1.5 hours, for example, like the program that you will hear tonight, most of the work, which in my case takes around 2 months, is done by myself. And then in this case, performing with Antal Zalai, a wonderful violinist, it took only around 2 to 3 days when it came to the collaboration and the ensemble aspect, that's to say, playing together. So to resume, to sum up, really it's about individual work and then just a little bit of ensemble practice together. That is what I would call the cherry on the cake.
Which are the funniest situations from the rehearsals?
Well, I think the question really is what hasn't been funny. This whole experience has been funny in the best sense of the word, that Antal contacted me around 3 years ago, completely, as we would say, out of the blue. In other words, without having known each other beforehand. And we agreed to embark on this tour together with no prior knowledge of our skills or our musical experiences, just rudimentary things like our recordings, etc. And here we are today in Romania, which is actually my first visit here to this beautiful country. Now to me that's enough comedy in itself, that two people have come together, embarked on a substantial tour of between 7 and 8 cities without ever having known each other. So that was enough comedy for me. But of course there are many other experiences that are worth talking about. My experience with the Romanian language is certainly something that has been great fun, and no doubt there will be many other wonderful experiences on this tour as we proceed.
How do you handle nerves before a difficult performance?
It's a very good question, and it's a very good question, the answer to which I'm still considering myself, because nerves are really an integral part of the musical performance. I have heard many artists say that without nerves, a musical performance will not be very successful. I'm not sure that I agree completely with this, because of course to have too many nerves can render a musical performance of lesser quality. In my own personal experience, what I like to do is to do breathing exercises in the Zen meditative style, just slow and relaxing breathing exercises in the dressing room beforehand. That helps a lot. But of course, the ultimate and only true solution to dealing with performance anxiety is to prepare as much as possible, to the greatest extent possible.
Why is classical music considered the universal language of mankind?
By classical music, do you mean Western classical music or classical music within other traditions as well?
With the traditions as well.
Other traditions, right. Because so many of these classical traditions have been around for centuries. In the Western tradition, we can trace the roots of Western classical music back to the medieval era in France. And in the Arab world, for example, we have records of musicians for centuries from what is modern-day Iraq actually coming to inspire many musicians across North Africa and Europe as well. And the same goes for India, for Africa, for South America, many other parts. So why is it considered a universal language? By some people, I have to say I'm not one of the people who agrees with this, because personally for me a universal language is, as one would deduce, a language that is spoken by everybody. I don't believe that classical music of each of these traditions is indeed universal, because of course I am not familiar with classical music from India or classical music from certain parts of the world to where I've never been. But I digress a little bit. So why is it considered by some to be a universal genre? I think principally it's because music, in many senses, within the classical tradition, does not use lyrics, or it is not sung. Of course, there are many, many exceptions to this across the world. And that's to say that if there isn't something that is spoken or that contains lyrics, it theoretically should be somewhat easier to understand. However, I'm not sure, and this is where I will bring my own perspective into play. If we regard certain pieces of art, for example, most of them do not use words or languages, but it is not necessarily comprehensible. It's not necessarily something that we can understand intuitively. So I do think that there still has to be a substantial aspect of education, and that, for me, is the key to understanding.
Please share a piece of music that holds a special meaning to you.
There are many pieces of music that have influenced me over the years. If I were to choose one, I suppose I would choose something by Johann Sebastian Bach. I'll tell you why, because I spent 4 years singing in a cathedral choir. In the UK, just of course as it is the case here, I'm sure, in Romania, Christianity was a real force in the country. It was a force for culture and a force that enabled many people to have access to music, because in the origin, I suppose, one could say, of Western classical music, one finds religion. Western classical music developed in churches. I spent 4 years singing as a chorister in a little city towards the west of England called Gloucester. And being a religious establishment, I had a big exposure to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and we performed works such as the St. Matthew Passion, the St. John Passion, which are iconic pieces of classical music. And so to this day, some of my favourite works would be, for example, the Well-Tempered Clavier of Johann Sebastian Bach, written for the keyboard instruments, and of course many others. It's a very difficult question to answer, because pieces of music touch us or affect us for many different reasons. But for me, a person who is very sentimental, I always look back to my childhood for the answer.
What are your future career goals and aspirations?
Well, often in my experience I find that music is a career in which you cannot choose, or you cannot foresee what you will do. For example, this tour is an example of this. I never saw myself sitting here in Tecuci with you fine people, and I'm very happy to be doing so. Of course, it is possible to say I would love to play in such and such a venue, I would love to play such and such a program. And of course I have aspirations like this. I would love to, for example, explore some of the lesser known piano concertos from the British Isles, including those by Stanford and Herbert Howells, who are British composers from the Romantic and early 20th century eras. But really, the truth is, as we would say, I go with the flow, and my career will develop in an organic manner. That is really the best I can say.
Do you think that classical music is only for the elite?
It's a very difficult question to answer this. I think many classical musicians would say absolutely not. But the truth is, if people say that, it is completely contrary to what many people think. And there is a sociological reason for this. Some have maintained that classical music used to be something, an entity that all people could enjoy. It wasn't always the case. For example, if we look at the operas, the opera tradition of the 18th century, for example, the 19th century, there was still an element of aristocracy to this. And in fact, often many of the operas would discuss stories and histories that really concerned the elite or the noble classes. Of course, there are major exceptions to this. But the problem is that these are major exceptions. So, why is it considered an elitist activity today? Well, for a start, we are often playing music by deceased composers. And in that way, I think the fact that these composers are no longer living indicates that they are not really part of our cultural life and our society to this day. Again, I'm not saying that I agree with that, I certainly do not. And so, classical music has become, in many ways, I think, a fine art, just like maybe we might, the art that we might see in contemporary and modern art galleries. That's to say, something that is perhaps on the fringes or on the outskirts of society. Really, I think the question to consider is how can we make it more accessible? How can we make it more approachable? And actually, I'm not the best person to answer this question because I'm a classical musician. Sometimes it's best to look at the exterior. I am deep within this industry, and of course I appreciate it in a way that many others can't. I would humbly say that, of course, we need to increase education in classical music. Access to education, I believe, is one of the foremost methods of spreading messages and enabling people to access things to which they might not have access otherwise. But it's not just education. For example, if we regard other genres of music, popular, rock, rap, I don't need to give you a full list. I don't think there are many people who learn the technicalities of EDM music or R&B at school. And so really there has got to be something else, something that really permeates through to the society. Now, that could be many things. I'm not here to magically give a solution within 2 minutes, but that could be greater access to classical music in the daily life. That's to say, we should have recordings of classical music playing. We should have classical music within family settings as well. Access, that means access to instruments, affordable pianos, for example. That's just, of course, a little snippet, a little excerpt of what we might need in society. Yes.
What is the role of classical music in shaping a personality?
That's a very good question as well. For me, classical music was a savior. Of course, that sounds very pretentious. It sounds very stupid, almost, to say that a genre of music that I had never heard prior to the age of 4 or 5 was somewhat of a savior. But my own personal story is that I grew up in Hong Kong, an ethnic minority. My father was Nigerian and my mother Filipino. And so already from a very young age, I discovered that I was on the fringe of society. Now, when you are living on the fringe or the edge of a society, whether that be for cultural reasons, whether it be for racial reasons or any other reasons, there are many, I think the thing that you will try to seek is a sense of rapport, a connection to something which resonates with you. Now, the thing that did resonate with me was music. And here I will backtrack a little bit to talk about languages. Because I grew up bilingual, I grew up speaking Cantonese and English. The English that I did speak at the time was Irish English, because I was adopted by an Irish family. So when I moved to the UK at the age of around 3 or 4, the English that I spoke was what we would call Hiberno English. It's the Irish dialect. And in the UK, that is very obvious. It sticks out. And so unfortunately, it was something that many people disliked, and they laughed at me for this. The only situation I found at the time during which people would not laugh or mock me was when I took the violin and played. And I mean that, it was the violin. That was the first instrument I ever picked up, that I ever played. And so it gave me a sense, I won't say of importance, but of self-confidence, that I could finally express myself without any accents or without any biases. It was the best thing that happened to me. So that is my personal story about how music became a good, or perhaps the best way of expressing myself. For others, of course, it is different. And again, I cannot speak for others, but only for myself.
What do you think about the fact that in Tecuci there is a private Athenaeum built by Mr. Spellin personal's money?
Well, firstly, I'm very lucky to be here. And I think it's safe to say that without Mr. Pellin, I would not be here. And again, in answer to a previous question, I talked about access to classical music and how we can possibly reduce the stigma of classical music being an elitist entity. Well, this is where organizations such as Mr. Pellin's really have a positive role to play. And I think, again, an organization like Mr. Pellin's is a force for good, not only within the domain of classical music, but also across the fine arts. Over lunch, just a moment ago, Mr. Pellin showed me that you've had all sorts of acts here. You've had K-pop, popular music here, as well as classical music. And so a space that can be used as a hybrid venue for many, many different art forms is a real asset to this community. And all I can say is thank you very much to Mr. Pellin for enabling us, Antal and I, to come here.
Mr. Heron, thank you for your this beautiful dialogue with you. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for your very interesting insights.
Thank you very much.